Week 3 of the fantasy football season, and here's the top 36 wide receivers. I'm ranking this week number 1 CeeDee Lamb and the Dallas Cowboys. So far narrowly going, one mediocre game and one good game for CeeDee Lamb. So this Cowboy team got blown out last week. New Orleans Saints. This week a possible shootout with the Baltimore Ravens coming to town. And CeeDee Lamb still has to get his legs under him a little bit. But so far I think he's been pretty decent as Lamb. And he's pretty much the only target on that offense for the most part in Dallas. Ferguson's banged up. We don't know if he's going to come back. Brandon Cooks, he had a decent week 1, Jalen Tolbert, but CeeDee Lamb gets peppered with targets, and this week in a potential shootout, I like him as the top receiver. Number 2, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. So Justin Jefferson, he's not going to miss any games, it looks like, for this Minnesota Viking team. Last week, a 97-yard touchdown, and already him and Sam Darnold are on the same page and going out there and making plays. So this week, in a matchup versus the Houston Texans, where I think he could get by that secondary a few times, is Jefferson. Even not at 100%, I like him having another nice ball game. Number 3, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Detroit Lions. St. Brown last week, what a ball game it was. After week 1, he didn't do much for the Lions or fantasy owners, but he went out there with a big game, over 100 yards, over 10 catches. I know he cramped up and he had some contusions, but he's not going to miss any time with St. Brown. And this week, a good matchup at the Arizona Cardinals, where their secondary I don't think is all that good. St. Brown, one of the best receivers in the league, one of the best route runners. And once again this week, I think he has a big ball game. Number 4, Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. So we know at minimum 2 is going to be out with the concussion for 4 weeks, going on injured reserve. And Skylar Thompson is going to be the quarterback most likely for the 4 weeks. So this week, a tougher matchup as well at Seattle. One of the best corners in the league, Tyreek Woolen, most likely going to be shadowing Tyreek Hill the majority of the game. But Tyreek Hill, it just takes one deep ball. And I think Skylar Thompson, he could get that out to Tyreek Hill. Saw Hill with backup quarterbacks a few years ago with the Dolphins. Still go out there and produce. Number 5, Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. First few weeks of the season, week 1, he didn't do much. He was under the weather, and the contract issues obviously didn't make him happy. And then last week, the Chiefs, they got into Chase's head and lost his cool, and he just couldn't focus with a down game. But this week, Monday Night Football, the second of the doubleheader, this is going to be a great matchup for Jamar Chase. We just saw Malik Neighbors go off for a monster ball game. And even if T. Higgins returns in this game, I don't see much from T. Higgins. I think Chase, this could be one of his big games of the season. And this week versus the Commanders, it's the right matchup. Number 6, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. And Nico Collins, many people thought with Diggs coming to town, it was going to take some production away from Collins. But obviously that hasn't been the problem. Collins, 2 weeks in a row to start the year, over 100 yards. He's a good route runner. Him and TJ Stroud are on the same page, and one of the best combos in the league, quarterback to wide receiver. And this week in a beatable matchup at the Minnesota Vikings. Indoor game as well on a fast track. I like Collins once again with a good performance. Number 7, Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. Week 1, a lot of people panicked. He only had 1 catch, 4 yards. And then last week, 7 minutes into the ball game, he already had over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. So him and Kyler Murray on the same page. This week, a good matchup versus the Lions secondary, where we just saw Chris Godwin go off. And I think Marvin Harrison, each and every week, he's the number 1 low-end option for fantasy owners at the receiver position. Number 8, Devontae Adams of the Vegas Raiders. Last week, a big game for Adams. 9 catches, 110 yards, and a touchdown. And this week, a great matchup with the Carolina Panthers coming to Vegas in the home opener. So Adams, I think he's still on the decline, but there's going to be some weeks like last week where he has a pop week and goes out there and puts points on the board. So this week, with another great matchup versus the Panthers, I think he goes out there and has a nice performance. Number 9, Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. Smith almost had 2 touchdowns in the Monday night ball game in a tough loss versus the Atlanta Falcons. He's the number 1 wide receiver right now for Jalen Hurts in this Eagle team, with A.J. Brown out multiple weeks with his hamstring injury. And this week, it's a beatable secondary. I know their defense has played well the first couple weeks of the season, but we saw last week CeeDee Lamb slip through and have a 65-yard touchdown. And Devonta Smith, you know the upside. He could score 30, 35 points in a ball game at any time. Number 10, Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. Rashee Rice, he's been skyrocketing up the ranking boards the first couple weeks of the season. Obviously the number 1 target, and I think he's even surpassed Travis Kelce as the number 1 target in the passing game. Kelce, he's not getting enough separation like he did over the last few seasons. He's declining in age as well. At 34, 35 years old is where wide receivers and tight ends start falling off. And Rashee Rice, obviously only in his second year, Him and Mahomes have a great rapport. And this week in a beatable matchup at Atlanta with Devonta Smith, had a nice ball game. I think Rashee Rice once again has a big one. Number 11, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Chris Godwin, more snaps in the slot this season, and it's made a huge difference. The first 2 weeks of the year, he's been a top 5, top 10 wide receiver. This week, a tougher matchup versus the Broncos. But I believe Patrick Surtain's going to be shadowing Mike Evans a majority of this game, where Chris Godwin's going to be in the slot. Last year had 1,000 yards, but a lot of non-impact games. But this season with new offensive coordinator, they've moved them in the slot. They moved them on both sides of the field, and it's paying big dividends. And Baker Mayfield has been one of the better quarterbacks in the early going this season. Number 12, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. So far, Garrett Wilson, his numbers are low, where I thought he wouldn't be a first-round pick, but I thought second round he was a solid pick for fantasy owners. But only 12 and 10 fantasy points the first 2 weeks in PPR leagues. This week, a decent matchup versus division rival, the New England Patriots. Garrett Wilson's a great talent. We saw last season with bad quarterback play in Zach Wilson, Tim Boyle. He went out there, still put over 1,000 yards. And this week, Thursday Night Football, where we know defense isn't played a lot, I think he could go out there, Garrett Wilson, and have a top 12 performance. But 13, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Mike Evans, we know he's a stud wide receiver, 10 seasons in a row with 1,000 yards. Last week, a little bit of an off game versus the Detroit Lions. And this week, he's most likely, like I said earlier in the video, going to have Patrick Surtain, one of the better corners in the league, cover him. But Mike Evans, he's a matchup-proof wide receiver. As long as him and Baker get that deep ball down the field, he's going to go out there and make plays. So last week where Godwin had the big game, I believe Mike Evans and this Buck team back home, they're going to put some points on the board. And Mike Evans will bounce back. 14, Malik Neighbors of the New York Giants. So maybe this is a little bit high for Malik Neighbors, but the first 2 weeks of the season, he's already had over 20 targets as Malik Neighbors. So he's a big play wide receiver. There's no one else on this team really. Wan'Dale Robinson in the passing game, Darius Slayton, Theo Johnson, Daniel Bellinger, but those guys aren't really threats. And Neighbors last week got peppered with targets, 18 targets, going over 100 yards, finding the end zone, 29 points in PPR leagues. And this week, I think even at a tough Cleveland Brown team with Denzel Ward most likely shadowing Neighbors a majority of the game, I still think he could go out there and work his way into production. 15, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. So this week, Jalen Ramsey might be on DK Metcalf, but I believe Ramsey isn't as elite corner as he used to be, and Metcalf still has a beatable matchup versus him. So Metcalf last week versus the Pats went out there, had a big performance, 129 yards, and he found the end zone. In this passing game, an offense is totally different and more explosive than it's been in years past, with new head coach, new offensive coordinator, and a whole new system, and it's working out for Geno and the Seattle offense. So this week, even with Jalen Ramsey on DK Metcalf, I think he could go out there and exploit the secondary. Number 16, Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers. Deebo Samuel now, he's going to miss multiple weeks with the injury. And it's unfortunate. Every season, Deebo Samuel pops up and misses a few ball games here and there. So Ayuk's 2 weeks, he definitely hasn't done anything. He hasn't had his legs under him. And no training camp definitely affects players. We see CeeDee Lamb's not what he was so far in the early going, even though he's had one decent game. And Jamar Chase hasn't done much. And Brandon Ayuk, week 1, dropped a touchdown. He usually catches. And then week 2, a pedestrian ball game. But now he's the number 1 wideout and more targets going to go his way in a beatable matchup at the Rams that Marvin Harrison just went off against. I think Ayuk bounces back. 17, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. So week 1, a quiet week. It was for Drake London. And week 2, it was a quiet week the majority of the game until the last drive and had the game-winning touchdown the last minute of the ball game. So London's a good route runner. Him and Kirk Cousins still working on rapport. And this week, they know they need to put points on the board. Is this Atlanta Falcon team to keep up with Kansas City, even though their offense isn't as high-powered as it's been in previous years? Still, they know they got to put points on the board, find the end zone. And Drake London and Cousins are starting to get things going. Number 18, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. And so far, it's been quiet for Chris Olave in the early going. And this week versus Philadelphia, though, it's a pretty solid matchup. But these other wide receivers, like I said, have been playing better than Chris Olave in the early going. But it wouldn't be surprising to me if Olave did come up with 100 yards in this ball game. This is a potential shootout, and Philadelphia is vulnerable to giving up big plays. We saw it in week 2, Darnell Mooney scoring a long touchdown, and we saw it in week 1, Jaden Reed with some long touchdowns in that one. So I think Chris Olave bounces back this week. Number 19, Stephon Diggs of the Houston Texans. Week 1, he had 2 touchdowns was Diggs at the Indianapolis Colts. And last week, it was the Nico Collins show. This week, matchup of one of his former teams, the Minnesota Vikings. I think Diggs could go out there. He could have a good ball game. I think he fits this team pretty well. And Tank Dell, his snaps have been reduced where Stephon Diggs has been on the field in 2 receiver sets, 20, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So this Bear offense as a whole, it's just been a train wreck so far the first 2 weeks of the season. But this week, a pretty decent matchup at the Indianapolis Colts where their defense has had trouble the first couple weeks of the season. So DJ Moore, week 1, he didn't do much. Last week, he did have double-digit fantasy points in PPR leagues, but him and Caleb Williams, they just couldn't connect on some plays. That last season, he was hitting with Justin Fields, DJ Moore. Definitely DJ Moore taking a step back where last season him and Justin Fields put in good work and he put up a big season. But this week, I still think he's a low-end number 2 receiver, 21 Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. So this week, I think it's a good matchup for Zay Flowers. This Cowboys secondary has trouble with speed. We saw Rashid Shaheed last week where he was going all over the field, and we saw Kamara in the passing game have a big ball game. So this week at the Dallas Cowboys, I think Zay Flowers, if he gets in space, he's going to go out there and make some big plays, and he's the number 1 target in the passing game for Baltimore. 22, Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. I know Waddle dropping down the list now with 2 out of the lineup, at least for 4 weeks, and this whole Dolphin offense play is going to fall down. But Jalen Waddle, we know, is a good route runner. We know yard after catch ability him and Tyreek he'll have. And I think Jalen Waddle still could go out there and be a solid number 2 option for fantasy owners at the wide receiver position. He could run all the routes. Like I said, if Thompson could just hit him in stride, he can make plays down the field and get yards after catch. In Seattle, I know their secondary is pretty decent, but if this is a game where they're trailing early and often is a Miami Dolphin team, they're going to have to start stretching the field, and I think Jalen Waddle still could come up with a decent ball game. Number 23, Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. Jameson Williams, people been waiting for the breakout the last 2 seasons. The first year coming off the ACL and suspension, he wasn't 100%, and then suspended a little bit in the second season, but now coming into the year with a full training camp and healthy, Jameson Williams, week 1, went out there over 120 yards, found the end zone. In week 2, for 75 yards in that game. So this week in a potential shootout at Arizona, I think Jameson Williams once again is going to go out there and have a good game, and he's taking some targets from Sam Laporta, and that's why his numbers have been down. 24, Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. So this week, a decent matchup versus the Miami Dolphins. Last week, a monster game for Njigba, over 100 yards, 11 catches, 16 targets, and he's going to fit this offense where they're starting to integrate him more with Tyler Lockett taking a little bit of a backseat. So this week with a good matchup and big targets last week, I think Njigba goes out there once again, and he's a solid number 2 wide receiver for fantasy owners. 25, Rashid Shaheed of the New Orleans Saints. So Shaheed's breaking out this season, and he's been a big deep ball threat throughout his career, but this year, so far, 2 games in a row, 2 deep touchdowns. Week 1, 3 catches, 73 yards, found the end zone. And last week versus the Cowboys, 4 catches, 96 yards on the touchdown. And they've used him on jet sweeps and different type of gadget plays as well. And this week, they know they got to put points on the board. Philadelphia, high-powered offense. This is going to be a great matchup early in the year between these NFC teams. And I like Rashid Shaheed as a back-end 2 flex option. 26, Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. So Amari Cooper, so far this season, it's been non-existent for him, and it's more Deshaun Watson's fault, I believe, than Cooper. Him and Cooper can't get on the same page. Last season, Amari Cooper was fine with Joe Flacco and Thompson Robinson and even P.J. Walker at times at the quarterback position. If Cooper can't get the job done this week versus the New York Giants, he's definitely going to bump down the ratings even more because the Giants secondary, one of the worst defenses in all pro football. We've seen receivers already have some big ball games versus them. And Amari Cooper, maybe the decline is in where he's 30 years old now, is Amari Cooper. And that's where wide receivers numbers, and they lose a step as well. 27, George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. This week, a decent matchup versus the Los Angeles Chargers. Last week, Kim Fields just missed on some big throws down the field. And Justin Fields, it looks like he's going to be the starter for this Pittsburgh Steelers team. They're 2-0. He's playing good quarterback. He hasn't turned the football over. He hasn't taken sacks. And George Pickens, we know he's a wide receiver that could catch the football if it's even close to his vicinity, making acrobatic grabs, and he has good hands. So this week versus the Chargers, I think Pickens is a back-end receiver to a flex option. Could be decent. 28, Calvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans. The last week, 24.7 fantasy points in PPR leagues for Calvin Ridley. He had an end around for a touchdown and then caught a crazy pass in between two defenders diving in the end zone versus the New York Jets. So he did a good job with Sauce Gardner on him, no doubt about it, was Calvin Ridley. But I just think the way this offensive line's constructed, Levis don't get a lot of time. And Levis, he's been making some bad mistakes in the first 2 weeks. I don't think Calvin Ridley goes out there and has a huge ball game, but someone who could score in that 10 to 13 point range, I believe, this week in PPR leagues. Number 29, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. So he's quickly falling down the rankings weekly as Michael Pittman, and he just doesn't fit, I believe, that well with Anthony Richardson at the quarterback position. Richardson, he likes hitting more players down the field in the seam and on the deep pass, where Michael Pittman's more of a route runner with slants and more a bubble screen type of route runner. He's not really a deep ball threat. And we know Richardson has the cannon arm and likes stretching the field, so we've seen Alec Pierce the first 2 weeks of the season contribute and be a big factor in the offense more than Pittman. But this week in a beatable matchup versus the Chicago Bears, I think Pittman's still a decent flex option. But if you don't get the job done this week, 3 weeks into the year, then maybe it's time for owners to move on. Number 30, Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Jr. and ETN, the only two options in this Jacksonville Jaguar offense I could trust. Gabe Davis, he really hasn't done much the last season and change. First 2 weeks, he hasn't been horrible, but not much. And Christian Kirk, I said coming into the preseason he wasn't going to play in a lot 2 receiver sets, and he's been non-existent for fantasy owners. So Brian Thomas, a tougher matchup at the Buffalo Bills. We saw last week they had a great game plan even before Tua got hurt. Shut down Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. And this week it's a tough matchup for the rookie, but they got him in the first round for a reason. And we've seen great flashes from him, where yards after catch and big playability from Brian Thomas. So as a flex option, I think he's fine. 31, Khalil Shakir, staying in the same game of the Buffalo Bills. So Shakir, to me, is the number 1 wide receiver on this Buffalo Bill team. Curtis Samuel's been non-existent in the early going. And also, Keon Coleman, he had a decent week 1, and then last week had a goose egg where Josh Allen rarely even targeted him. So Shakir, as a flex option or number 3 wide receiver in PPR leagues, he's fine. And this Jacksonville secondary isn't all that great. 32, Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. So Tank Dell, it's been tough sledding for him the first 2 weeks of the season. And obviously, he's the number 3 wide receiver. He's not in there on 2 receiver sets for this Houston Texan team. But this week, it's a good matchup indoors at the Minnesota Vikings, where I think there's a possibility we might see Tank Dell get behind the secondary and find the end zone. But like I said, if he can't get the job done this week, it's very likely most fantasy owners will try to trade him or just bench him until they see improvement. But this week, I'll give Tank Dell one more chance as a flex option. 33, Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. So it looks like, once again, Malik Willis is going to start at quarterback with Jordan Love out. And we figured Jordan Love was going to be out 3 to 6 weeks with the MCL injury. So Jaden Reed last week, he didn't do much in that ball game. This week, a pretty tough matchup at the Tennessee Titans, where their defense has played well versus receivers. Week 1, no one did anything on Chicago. And last week, they bottled up Garrett Wilson for the most part, was his secondary. So Jaden Reed is a back-end flex option. I still believe is the only guy in this offense that could be consistent for the most part when Malik Willis, besides Josh Jacobs. 34, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. So far, the first 2 weeks of the year, we've seen nothing from Terry McLaurin. And I don't like McLaurin as an option, but he is a number 1 wide receiver on this Washington Commander team. This week, we know they're most likely going to have to throw the football a whole lot at the Cincinnati Bengals. And after that ball game, the way it went down with Cincinnati, they want to get off to a good start and put a lot of points on the board versus Commander team, where I think Jaden Daniels, he's got to have more poise in the pocket a little bit and stay in the pocket a little bit more. He's bailing out and looking to run a little too much as the rookie Daniels. So this week, we'll see if McLaurin could go out there and do anything. 35, Keenan Allen of the Chicago Bears. So Keenan Allen, he's tough to trust. With Caleb Williams just struggles, offensive line struggles for this Chicago Bear team, and already with injuries for Keenan Allen. 32 years old, I think this could be the start of a big decline for Allen. I know last season he had a great year with the Los Angeles Chargers, but they shipped him off in the offseason for a 4th-round pick because they don't want to give him a contract extension, and his deal's up after the year. But this week it's a decent matchup at the Indianapolis Colts. But if Keenan Allen plays, I don't think the ceiling is that high the way this offense is played. And the 36 and final wideout rankings, Quentin Johnston of the Los Angeles Chargers. I know Quentin Johnson, he seemed like a bust last season. He didn't do anything. And this year, coming into fantasy drafts, he was only drafted in 4% of fantasy leagues. But he is the number one wide receiver, it looks like, over there for the Chargers. He was a first-round pick for a reason. And last year, he did have Keenan Allen, and early in the year, Mike Williams ahead of him before he tore the ACL. So I think Quentin Johnson, we saw last week, he went out there, 5 catches, 51 yards, and found the end zone. And this week, in a matchup where it's going to be a grinded-out performance at the Steelers, I think Johnston, as a back-end option in deeper leagues, could be all right. So that's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for Week 3 of the fantasy football season.